Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Sound of Sinking. The water didn't just roar, it screamed. It was a heavy, suffocating wall of brown and gray that smashed against the glass until the windows spider-webbed, then shattered. In the dream, the cold was a physical blade, carving through Gino's chest as the interior of the sedan vanished into a murky void. He could see Gab, his brother's profile illuminated by the dying glow of the dashboard lights, reaching out, fingers brushing Gino's sleeve before the current ripped them apart. Then came the silence. The terrible, pressurized silence of being buried alive in a liquid tomb. Gino's eyes snapped open. He bolted upright, a strangled, raw shriek tearing from his throat before he could catch it. He was in his bedroom. The air was dry. The only sound was the frantic, wet thud of his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Breathe," he wheezed, clenching his fists into the damp sheets. "Gino, breathe. You're on land. You're on land." He was drenched. Sweat had turned his gray t-shirt into a second skin, clinging to the pale, jagged scar that ran from his collarbone down across his ribs, a permanent souvenir from the jagged metal of the door frame. His lungs burned as if he had actually been holding his breath for the last 4 minutes. With trembling legs, he swung his feet off the bed. The floor was solid. It didn't tilt, it didn't sink. He stumbled toward the nightstand, his coordination frayed by the adrenaline spike. His hands shook so violently that the amber plastic pill bottle rattled like a maraca against the wood. It took 3 tries to pop the cap. He didn't bother with water. He swallowed the medication dry, wincing as the bitter film coated his tongue. He sat there in the dark for a long time, watching the digital clock flicker from 4:14 to 4:15 a.m. By 9 a.m., the Gino who screamed in the dark had been meticulously tucked away behind a crisp white button-down and a charcoal blazer. The elevators at Carlton Tech were glass, a design choice Gino usually loathed because it felt too much like being suspended in a bubble, but today he kept his eyes fixed on his reflection. At 32, he had the kind of height that usually commanded a room, standing an inch or 2 taller than most of the executive board, but today he felt small. He felt porous. As he walked toward the marketing department on the 12th floor, the atmosphere shifted. "Morning, Gino," Sarah from accounting said, her voice dropping into that hushed, fragile register people used in funeral homes. She reached out, patting his arm with a lingering, pitying squeeze. "You look a little pale today. Did you sleep okay?" "I'm fine, Sarah." "Just a long night," Gino lied, offering a practiced, tight-lipped smile. "If you need to head to the break room for a lie down, I'll cover your calls," Leon whispered as Gino reached his desk. Leon was his only real friend here, and his concern was authentic, but it still felt like a weight. "You've got that look in your eyes again, man. The 'I'm drowning on dry land' look." "I have a strategy meeting at 10, Leon." "I'm fine." Gino sat down and stared at his dual monitors, forcing his mind to engage with SEO metrics and consumer demographics. He was good at this. Data didn't have emotions. Data didn't sink. An hour into his work, the air in the room seemed to sharpen. The low hum of office chatter died down to a respectful murmur. Gino didn't have to look up to know who had entered the floor. Ziggy Carlton. The CEO was 29, a prodigy of industry who usually moved through the building like a shark in a tailored suit, fast, cold, and indifferent to the smaller fish. His office was on the 18th floor, a glass fortress in the sky. He had no business on the 12th floor on a Tuesday morning. Gino kept his head down, but he could feel the shadow stop near his cubicle. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a pair of polished Italian leather Oxfords. The Q3 projections for the Aura campaign, Ziggy's voice was a low, resonant baritone. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but the proximity was undeniable. "I want them on my desk by noon." "I'm working on them now, Mr. Carlton," Gino said, finally looking up. Ziggy was leaning against the edge of a nearby filing cabinet, looking bored, yet his dark eyes were locked onto Gino with an intensity that felt almost invasive. He wasn't looking at the spreadsheets, he was looking at the slight tremor in Gino's hand as he held his mouse. "You're sweating, Mckenzie," Ziggy noted. His tone was clipped, his ruthless CEO mask firmly in place, but he didn't move away. He hovered, a strange, silent sentinel in the middle of the busy floor. "Is the AC insufficient on this level?" "I'm just a bit warm, sir." "It's no trouble." "See that it isn't," Ziggy said. He lingered for a beat too long, long enough for Leon to shoot Gino a confused glance, before turning on his heel. "Noon. Don't be late." As Ziggy walked away, Gino let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't know why the most powerful man in the company felt the need to haunt his cubicle, but as he wiped a bead of cold sweat from his temple, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ziggy Carlton was looking at him less like a boss, and more like a man watching a timer count down to 0. Chapter 2, The 18th-Floor Descent. The morning air in the office felt thick, like it was saturated with invisible humidity. Gino tried to bury himself in the Aura campaign metrics, but the fluorescent light seemed to hum at a frequency that vibrated right behind his eyes. By 10:30 a.m., the office had reached its peak decibel level. The clacking of mechanical keyboards, the distant chime of the elevator, and the low, constant drone of the ventilation system were starting to feel like physical pressure. "I'm going to grab more water," Gino muttered to Leon, who was deep in a phone call. He retreated toward the break room, a small, sterile sanctuary at the end of the hall. He needed the silence. He needed to splash cold water on his face and remind himself that the floor under his feet was solid concrete, not shifting silt. The break room was empty. The large, 5-gallon water cooler sat in the corner, its blue plastic jug reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Gino reached for a paper cup, his fingers still retaining that stubborn, faint quiver. He pressed the lever. The water began to flow, but as the air bubble surged up to the top of the jug, the machine let out a deep, hollow glug glug glug. The sound hit Gino like a physical strike. Glug. It was the sound of air escaping the cabin of the car. Glug. It was the sound of the river claiming the space where his lungs used to be. Gino's grip failed. The paper cup crumpled, and water splashed over his hand, cold, biting, and terrifying. He didn't just see the water, he felt the weight of the river pressing against his eardrums. The walls of the break room seemed to tilt, the white tiles blurring into the murky brown of the current. "Gab," he whispered, his throat tightening until it felt like it was closing shut. He slumped against the counter, his knees buckling. He couldn't breathe. Every time he tried to draw air, his brain told him he was inhaling water. He slid down to the floor, his back scraping against the cabinets, hands clawing at his chest as he tried to find air that wasn't there. He was back in the sedan. He was trapped. He was alone. The door to the break room swung open. Gino squeezed his eyes shut, expecting the pitying gasp of a coworker or the frantic call for an ambulance that would only embarrass him further. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He just wanted to drown in peace. "Out." The voice was a sharp, frigid command. It wasn't a request. "But Mr. Carlton, I was just coming in for," a female voice started, sounding startled. "I said out. Close the door behind you. Nobody enters this room until I say otherwise." The click of the latch felt like the turning of a key in a lock. Then, there was the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps. A shadow fell over Gino. He expected the ruthless CEO to bark at him to get up, to tell him that panic attacks weren't on the company's Q3 schedule. Instead, he felt a pair of strong, warm hands catch his shoulders just as he was about to topple over sideways. "Gino. Look at me." Gino shook his head, his breath coming in jagged, terrifying hitches. "Gino, listen to my voice. You're not there." Ziggy's voice had lost its sharp edge. It was low, grounded, and strangely frantic. "You're in the break room. You're at Carlton Tech. The floor is dry. Look at the floor, Gino." Ziggy dropped to his knees in front of him, heedless of his expensive trousers hitting the linoleum. He didn't maintain the professional distance he was famous for. He reached out and took Gino's shaking hands, pressing them flat against the solid, tiled floor. Feel that? It's solid. It's not moving. Focus on the tile. Gino's eyes flickered open, blurred with tears of sheer terror. He saw Ziggy Carlton's face just inches from his own. The CEO looked pale, paler than Gino, perhaps. There was a look in Ziggy's eyes that didn't belong on a boss. It was a look of raw, unadulterated guilt, masked poorly by a veneer of concern. Why? Gino wheezed, his chest finally hitching a full breath of air. Why are you here? Ziggy stiffened, his grip on Gino's hands tightening for a fraction of a second before he pulled back, reclaiming his composure like a suit of armor. He stood up, though he offered a hand to help Gino rise. I was in the area, Ziggy said, his voice returning to that clipped, neutral baritone. I was heading to the 12th floor to check on the server room. The server room is on the 14th floor, sir, Gino said, his voice weak as he used the counter to steady himself. Ziggy's jaw tightened. He looked away, his gaze landing on the spilled water on the floor. He looked at it as if it were a crime scene. I took the wrong stairs, Ziggy lied. It was a blatant, clumsy lie, the kind a man of his intellect shouldn't have made. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief, handing it to Gino. Clean yourself up. You have 5 minutes. Then go back to your desk. If anyone asks, I was reprimanding you for the delay on the projections. Gino took the handkerchief. It smelled of expensive sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone. Thank you, Mr. Carlton. Ziggy didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the door, but just before he opened it, he paused. He didn't look back. Take the rest of the hour, Ziggy muttered. That's an order. As the door closed, Gino looked down at the handkerchief in his hand. He was still shaking, but the CEO of Carlton Tech had been on his knees on a break room floor just to hold his hands. It made no sense. Outside, in the hall, he could hear Leon's voice. Mr. Carlton? Is Gino okay? I heard a noise. Mckenzie is fine, Ziggy's voice boomed, cold and distant once more. He made a mistake on a file. I've dealt with it. Get back to work, Leon. Gino leaned his head against the cool plastic of the water cooler. He was curious, so curious it almost outweighed the fear. But for now, he just had to survive the next hour. Chapter 3, The Passenger Seat. The weekend offered no sanctuary. For Gino, Saturday was merely a long stretch of silence where the walls of his apartment felt like they were slowly closing in. He spent most of the morning staring at his car keys, which sat in a dusty ceramic bowl by the door. They hadn't been touched in 4 months. The thought of walking down to the basement parking lot made his throat constrict, so he stayed inside, watching the shadows of clouds move across his living room wall. A sharp, rhythmic knocking at the door startled him. Gino frowned, checking his phone. No deliveries, no messages from Leon. He stood up, smoothing his wrinkled shirt, and opened the door. Ziggy Carlton stood in the hallway. He wasn't wearing his usual 3-piece armor. He was in a dark navy sweater and tailored chinos, looking younger and somehow more dangerous without the corporate shield. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, his eyes scanning Gino with a restless, hungry intensity. Mr. Carlton. Gino blinked, leaning against the doorframe. What are you doing here? Ziggy flinched at the title, a small twitch of his jaw that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I have your emergency contact info on file. HR records, he said quickly, his voice tight. He didn't wait for an invitation, he stepped into the small entryway, his presence instantly making the apartment feel cramped. You look like you haven't seen the sun in days, Gino. Get your shoes. We're going out. I'm not really up for. It wasn't a suggestion, Ziggy interrupted, his CEO persona flickering back to life, though his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. You need air. I need to drive. Let's go. Gino wanted to refuse. He wanted to point out how wildly inappropriate it was for his boss to be standing in his foyer demanding a Sunday outing. But there was something in Ziggy's expression, a frantic, desperate kind of penance, that made the words die in Gino's throat. Okay, Gino whispered. Just a walk in the park. Something like that, Ziggy replied. The dread didn't hit Gino until they reached the street. Parked at the curb was a heavy, silver SUV. It was polished to a mirror finish, looking like a tank designed for the wealthy. Gino stopped dead on the sidewalk. His breath hitched. The sight of the door handle, the chrome glinting in the sun, sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Metal. Glass. Trapped. Gino. Ziggy was already at the driver's side, but he stopped when he saw Gino's face. He walked around the hood, his expression softening into something pained. Without a word, he opened the passenger door. It's a high safety rating, Ziggy said, his voice barely audible. The heaviest frame on the market. It won't break. Gino swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't want to show his weakness again, not after the break room incident. He forced his leaden legs to move, climbing into the seat. The leather was soft, but to Gino, it felt like a cage. As Ziggy climbed in and started the engine, the low hum of the motor made Gino's hands fly to his knees, gripping the fabric of his pants until his knuckles turned white. We can stay parked, Ziggy said, his hand hovering over the gear shift. He was watching Gino's profile, his jaw set so tight it looked like it might snap. We don't have to move, Mr. Mckenzie. No, Gino gasped, closing his eyes. I have to. I can't keep taking the bus forever. Just go. Please, Mr. Carlton. Ziggy didn't shift into gear. Instead, he turned fully toward Gino, his hand resting on the back of the passenger headrest. Drop it, Ziggy said softly. Gino opened one eye. Drop what? Mr. Carlton. The CEO. All of it. Ziggy's eyes were dark, searching Gino's face with a vulnerability that felt raw. Out here, I'm not the man on the 18th floor. I'm just. Ziggy. Please. When it's just us, call me Ziggy. Gino looked at him, surprised by the request. The power dynamic that usually felt like a mountain between them seemed to level out for a brief, flickering second. Gino was 32, older and taller than the man beside him, yet Ziggy looked small in the driver's seat of his own car. Okay, Gino managed, his voice a dry rasp. Ziggy. The name seemed to settle something in the younger man's chest. He nodded once, sharply, and finally shifted into drive. He drove with an almost agonizing degree of caution. He stayed 5 miles under the speed limit. He kept a 3-car distance from anyone in front of them. His hands were at 10 and 2, his grip so fierce the leather of the steering wheel creaked. Gino sat in absolute silence, his eyes locked on the horizon, praying the road wouldn't end. Every time another car sped past them, Gino flinched, his body bracing for an impact that didn't come. You're very quiet, Ziggy said after 10 minutes of suffocating tension. Just tired, Gino lied. It was a pathetic shield, and they both knew it. Ziggy didn't call him on it. He just reached over, his hand lingering in the space between them as if he wanted to touch Gino's arm but didn't have the right. He pulled the hand back, gripping the wheel again. I used to think speed was the only thing that mattered, Ziggy said suddenly, his voice dark and hollow. Getting there first. Beating the clock. I was arrogant. Gino turned his head slightly. You're a CEO, Ziggy. Arrogance is practically in the job description. It shouldn't be, Ziggy muttered. They drove for an hour, eventually winding through a quiet, tree-lined suburb before heading back. When Ziggy finally pulled up to Gino's building and put the car in park, the silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning, Ziggy said. It wasn't a question. For work. You shouldn't be breathing in bus fumes. Gino looked at him, truly looked at him. Ziggy was staring straight ahead, his profile rigid. Why are you doing this, Ziggy? Truly. I'm just a strategist. You have 1,000 employees. Ziggy finally turned. For a second, the mask dropped entirely, and Gino saw a man who looked like he was drowning in a river of his own making. Because I can't have you shaking in break rooms, Ziggy said, his voice cracking. I can't. I need to know you're safe. Gino got out of the car, his legs feeling like jelly. As he watched the silver SUV pull away, he felt a strange, confusing warmth blooming in his chest. He thought it was the beginning of a crush. He had no idea it was the beginning of a reckoning. Chapter 4, Ghost in the Machine. The morning commutes became the spine of Gino's week. Every day at 7:30 a.m., the silver SUV would be idling at the curb. Ziggy never called or texted, he was simply there, a silent, mechanical certainty in a world that had felt increasingly fragile. Inside the car, the silence had shifted. It was no longer a taut wire, it was more like a shared breath. Ziggy drove with the same hypervigilance, but he began to relax his grip on the wheel just enough to talk. He spoke about his frustrations with the board of directors, his distaste for the networking galas he was forced to attend, and his surprisingly deep knowledge of architecture. Gino, in turn, found himself leaning back into the leather seat. The panic hadn't vanished, but it had retreated to a dull hum, muffled by Ziggy's presence. You're staring at the park, Ziggy noted one Thursday morning, slowing down as they passed a sprawling green space filled with joggers. My brother, Gab, he used to take me there every Sunday, Gino said, the words slipping out before he could filter them. He felt a sharp pang in his chest, but for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by the sensation of drowning. He was a landscape photographer. He said the light in this city was best right before it rained. I used to tell him he was just being dramatic. Ziggy's foot faltered on the accelerator, causing the car to jerk slightly. He quickly corrected it, his knuckles turning white. He sounded like a talented man. He was everything, Gino said softly, looking out the window. After our parents passed, he was the one who made sure I went to college. He worked 3 jobs just to keep me in a good dorm. He was the driver that day. He stayed behind so I could get out. The car swerved, crossing the yellow line for a fraction of a second before Ziggy yanked the wheel back. A horn blared behind them, the sound echoing harshly in the cabin. Ziggy. Gino gripped the door handle, his heart leaping into his throat. I'm sorry, Ziggy wheezed. He pulled the car over into a bus lane and slammed it into park. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide and fixed on the dashboard. I'm sorry. A bird. I thought I saw a bird hit the windshield. Gino reached out, his fingers brushing Ziggy's shoulder. It's okay. We're stopped. We're safe. Ziggy let out a shaky breath that sounded suspiciously like a sob. He didn't pull away from Gino's touch, instead, he leaned into it almost imperceptibly. You mentioned a settlement. In the office once. You said it helped you. Gino nodded, his hand sliding down to Ziggy's arm in a gesture of comfort. Yeah. The other driver's lawyers were aggressive, but they paid out a massive sum. I used it for the funeral. The medical bills. I still have some of it left. To be honest, I never looked at the names on the papers. I didn't want to know who they were. I hated them for a long time, but eventually, I realized that knowing their face wouldn't bring Gab back. It would just give me someone to haunt. Ziggy looked at Gino then, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unvarnished agony. He looked like he wanted to scream, or perhaps fall to his knees right there in the driver's seat. You're a good man, Gino, Ziggy whispered, his voice thick. Better than anyone I know. I'm just trying to move forward, Ziggy. Like you told me to. Ziggy turned away, staring through the windshield at the road ahead. I stopped drinking, you know. After, a while ago. I realized I couldn't trust myself if I wasn't in total control. That's a good thing, Gino said, smiling gently. You seem like the type of person who carries the world on his shoulders. You don't need a clouded mind for that. Ziggy didn't smile back. He shifted the car back into drive, his movements robotic. I should get you to the office. You have the branding meeting at 10. For the rest of the drive, Ziggy didn't say another word. But as Gino stepped out of the car at the corporate entrance, he noticed Ziggy's hand was trembling, not from a nightmare, but from the weight of a secret that was beginning to crack its shell. Chapter 5, The Paper Trail. The atmosphere at Carlton Tech was unusually frantic. A major acquisition was in its final stages, and the marketing department was the engine room keeping the ship afloat. For Gino, the workload was a blessing. The more he stared at pivot tables, the less he saw the phantom ripples of the river. By late afternoon, the office had thinned out. Leon had headed to a late lunch, and most of the strategists were in a breakout room on the 14th floor. Gino was finishing a cross-departmental audit when a notification popped up on his screen. Access granted, Executive Archive, Case File #882-C. Gino frowned. He had requested data on a previous tech merger for benchmarking, but the link had directed him into a restricted legal folder. It happened sometimes, the permissions for senior strategists often overlapped with corporate legal during acquisitions. He was about to close the tab when a date caught his eye. October 14th. The date of the accident. His heart gave a dull, heavy thud. It was a common date, thousands of things happened on October 14th, but the file wasn't listed under a company name. It was listed under personal liability, settlement dispersal. Gino's hand hovered over the mouse. He knew he should close the window. He knew he should go back to the branding deck. But the curiosity was a cold itch at the back of his neck. He clicked the PDF. The first page was a standard non-disclosure agreement. He scrolled past the legalese. The second page was a police report summary. Location, North Bridge Interchange. Time, 11:24 p.m. Weather, heavy rain. Gino's breath hitched. That was his bridge. That was his rain. He scrolled down to the parties involved section. Vehicle A, 2024 sedan. Operator, Gabriel Mckenzie, deceased. Passenger, Gino Mckenzie, injured. Gino's eyes blurred. Seeing Gab's name in a sterile, 12-point font felt like a fresh wound. He gripped the edge of his desk, his vision tunneling as he forced himself to look at the next line. Vehicle B, 2026 SUV. Operator, Ziggy Carlton. BAC 0.12. The world stopped. The hum of the office, the distant ring of a telephone, the sound of his own breathing, it all vanished, replaced by a roaring silence. Ziggy Carlton. He read it again. And again. He looked at the blood alcohol content. 0.12, Ziggy had been drunk. He hadn't just swerved, he had been the catalyst. The anonymous driver who had sent their car over the railing, the man who had vanished behind a wall of high-priced lawyers and confidential settlements, was the same man who had been picking him up every morning for the last month. The hovering. The concern. The way Ziggy had looked at him in the break room with such pained eyes. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship. It was a long-term payment plan for a guilty conscience. Gino. The voice was soft, hesitant. Gino didn't look up. He couldn't. He watched the cursor on the screen blink over Ziggy's name. Ziggy was standing at the entrance to his cubicle. He had come down from the 18th floor, likely to check on the Q3 projections he'd used as an excuse all day. When Gino didn't respond, Ziggy stepped closer, his eyes dropping to the monitor. The silence that followed was different from any they had shared. It was the silence of a glass vase shattering in slow motion. Ziggy didn't make an excuse. He didn't lie about birds or server rooms. He simply went ashen, his skin turning a ghostly, translucent gray. His hand reached out for the desk to steady himself, his fingers brushing a stack of papers. Gino, Ziggy whispered, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. I was going to tell you. I was waiting for the right. The right what? Gino's voice was terrifyingly calm. He finally turned his head, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The right chapter. The right mile on the drive home. I didn't know it was you. Ziggy stepped back, his chest heaving. Not until I saw your HR file after you came back from medical leave. I saw the date. I saw the name of the deceased. I realized what I had done. So you decided to play hero? Gino stood up. He was an inch taller than Ziggy, and for the first time, he used that height to look down on him. You decided that if you drove me to work and held my hand during a panic attack, it would make up for the fact that you killed my brother? No. No, I couldn't leave you alone. Ziggy's eyes were frantic, filling with tears he refused to let fall. I saw how much pain you were in, and I knew I was the cause. I just wanted to help. You didn't help, Gino said, his voice cracking as the rage finally began to boil through the shock. You haunted me. You made me trust you. You made me feel safe in the same kind of car that ruined my life. Gino grabbed his coat. He didn't take his bag. He didn't shut down his computer. Gino, please, wait. Don't follow me, Gino snapped, his fingers shaking as he pointed it at Ziggy's chest. Don't ever come near me again. Consider this my resignation. You'll have the formal papers when I can stand to type your name again. Gino walked past him, his shoulder brushing Ziggy's with enough force to make the younger man stumble. He didn't look back as he hit the elevator button. He didn't look back as the doors closed on the image of Ziggy Carlton collapsing against a filing cabinet, his face buried in his hands. Gino didn't go home. He just walked. He walked until his lungs burned and the sun went down, trying to find a way to breathe in a world that had just gone underwater all over again. Chapter 6, The Vanishing Act. The silence in Gino's apartment was no longer the silence of recovery, it was the silence of a tomb. He moved through the rooms with a cold, mechanical efficiency. He didn't cry, there was no room for tears in a chest filled with lead. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the police report. BAC 0.12. The number looped in his mind like a mocking chant. While Gino had been screaming in the dark, trying to pull Gab's limp hand from the rising water, Ziggy had been sitting behind a desk, protected by a phalanx of lawyers and a mountain of cash. Gino didn't pack everything. He left the furniture, the heavy things, the items that felt anchored to this city. He took his clothes, his laptop, and the small, framed photo of Gab that sat on his nightstand. He used the last of the settlement money, the money he had once thought was a mercy from a faceless stranger, to put a deposit on a small house 3 hours outside the city. It was a place where the air smelled of salt and pine, far away from the glass towers of Carlton Tech. By sunrise, Gino was gone. He left his keys on the kitchen counter, changed his phone number, and deleted every social media account he owned. He didn't just resign, he evaporated. Back in the city, the 18th floor of Carlton Tech had become a place of mourning. Ziggy hadn't left his office in 3 days. The ruthless CEO was gone, replaced by a ghost in a wrinkled shirt. He sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the empty chair across from him where he had once imagined Gino sitting during a promotion he'd planned to give him. Sir. His assistant, Marcus, whispered from the doorway. The board is asking about the acquisition. You missed the signing. Leave, Ziggy said. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. Mr. Carlton, Leon from marketing is outside. He says it's urgent. He says Gino's apartment is. Ziggy was on his feet before the sentence finished. He drove himself this time. He didn't use the SUV, it felt like a rolling coffin. He took a nondescript sedan and drove like a madman to Gino's address. He sprinted up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs, praying for the sound of Gino's voice, for a shout of anger, for anything. The door was unlocked. Ziggy pushed it open. The apartment was stripped of its soul. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sun where a TV used to be. The kitchen smelled of nothing. Ziggy walked into the bedroom. He saw the bed, unmade and cold. He looked at the nightstand. The ceramic bowl that used to hold Gino's car keys was empty. The photo of Gab was gone. No, Ziggy whispered, leaning against the doorframe, the same one Gino had leaned against just weeks ago when they had gone for their first drive. No, Gino, please. He searched the drawers, desperate for a note, a forwarding address, a scrap of paper. He found nothing but a discarded bottle of Gino's anxiety medication, half full and forgotten. Ziggy sank to the floor, clutching the plastic bottle to his chest. The guilt, which had been a low-simmering fever for months, finally broke into a full-blown delirium. He hadn't just killed Gab, he had hunted the survivor and forced him into a masquerade of healing. For the next 2 weeks, the CEO of Carlton Tech became a shadow. He didn't go to meetings. He barely eats and sleeps. He hired 3 different private investigation firms with one directive: find him. Don't approach him. Just find him. He spent his sleepless nights looking at the Aura campaign files Gino had worked on. He traced the lines of Gino's handwriting on old memos. He realized, with a crushing finality, that he had fallen in love with the man he had broken, and in doing so, he had ensured that Gino could never love him back. On the 14th day, a file landed on his desk. It contained a single address in a coastal suburb 3 hours away. Ziggy didn't call his driver. He didn't pack a bag. He grabbed his coat and his keys, his eyes bloodshot and determined. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't think he deserved forgiveness. But he couldn't let Gino be alone in the dark anymore, even if the person Gino was hiding from was him. Chapter 7: The Rain and the Porch. The suburb was a place of muted colors and low-slung roofs, a sharp contrast to the aggressive verticality of the city. Here, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant, briny tang of the sea. Gino had chosen a house that sat at the end of a gravel road, a small, graying cottage with a porch that creaked under the weight of the wind. Inside, Gino was trying to build a new life out of silence. He spent his days working as a freelance consultant, his laptop the only link to a world he had discarded. He didn't think about the 12th floor. He didn't think about the 18th floor. But every time a silver car passed on the main road, his heart would skip a beat, a reflexive spasm of fear and fury he couldn't quite extinguish. Then, the rain came. It wasn't a drizzle, it was a deluge, the kind of torrential downpour that turned the gravel road into a stream and hammered against the roof like 1,000 drumsticks. Gino sat in his darkened living room, a cup of tea cooling in his hands, watching the lightning illuminate the skeletal trees outside. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom. Gino froze. The car was a nondescript sedan, mud-splattered and weary, but the way it pulled into his driveway was familiar. It was cautious. It was deliberate. The engine cut out. For a long time, no one got out. Then, the driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped into the storm. Gino's breath hitched. Even through the sheets of rain, he recognized that silhouette. The sharp set of the shoulders, the way the head was held, it was Ziggy. But the man walking toward his porch didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. A knock sounded at the door. Low. Hesitant. Gino didn't move. He sat in the dark, his pulse roaring in his ears. Go away, he thought. Go back to your glass tower. Go back to your lies. The knock came again. And then, silence. Gino waited for the sound of the car engine, for the crunch of gravel as Ziggy retreated. But it never came. He walked to the window and peeled back the curtain just an inch. Ziggy wasn't leaving. He was sitting on the top step of the porch, his back against the door. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have a jacket. He was wearing a thin dress shirt that was already translucent from the rain, clinging to his skin like a shroud. I'm not opening the door, Ziggy. Gino yelled through the wood, his voice cracking. Go home. There was no answer from the other side, only the relentless lash of the rain. Gino paced the room. An hour passed. Then 2. Every time he looked out the window, Ziggy was still there, a dark smudge against the gray light of the storm. The temperature was dropping. The coastal wind was turning the rain into needles of ice. Let him stay there, Gino told himself, clutching his elbows. Let him feel a fraction of the cold Gab felt. But as the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., the anger began to be eroded by a stubborn, unwanted tether of concern. He remembered Ziggy's hands in the break room. He remembered the way Ziggy had driven him home with such agonizing care. Gino didn't sleep. He sat by the door, listening to the wind, until the first light of dawn began to bleed through the clouds. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing mist. Gino finally turned the lock. The door swung inward. Ziggy didn't fall back, he was slumped sideways against the railing, his head lolling against his chest. Ziggy? Gino whispered, his anger vanishing under a wave of genuine alarm. He reached out and touched Ziggy's shoulder. The younger man was ice-cold. His skin was a deathly, translucent pale, and his lips were a terrifying shade of blue. He was shivering so violently that his teeth were clicking together, a rhythmic, hollow sound. Ziggy's eyes flickered open. They were bloodshot and unfocused, searching Gino's face with a dazed, heartbreaking desperation. Gino, he rasped. His voice was barely a breath, stripped of all its baritone authority. I'm sorry. I didn't want to leave. I had to tell you. You're a fool, Gino hissed, but his hands were already reaching under Ziggy's arms, hauling him up. Ziggy was nearly dead weight, his coordination gone to the cold. You're an absolute, arrogant fool. He dragged Ziggy inside, the CEO stumbling over his own feet. Gino led him straight to the bathroom, kicking the heater on and stripping the wet, freezing clothes off the younger man's body with clinical, frantic movements. Ziggy didn't protest, he couldn't. He just stood there, shaking, his eyes never leaving Gino's. Get in the shower, Gino commanded, turning the water to a steady, lukewarm stream, nothing too hot, or the shock would be too much. Now. He pushed Ziggy into the stall and closed the glass door. He stood there for a moment, his forehead pressed against the cool tile, listening to the sound of the water and the ragged, choking sobs that finally started to break out of Ziggy's chest. Gino went to the kitchen and moved with practiced movements, heating milk and honey, his hands trembling almost as much as Ziggy's. When he returned to the bathroom, the steam had filled the room. Ziggy was sitting on the floor of the shower, the water hitting his bowed head, his shoulders heaving. Gino opened the door and handed him a thick, dry towel. Come on. Out. You need to drink this. Ziggy emerged, wrapped in the towel like a child. He sat on the edge of the bathtub, taking the mug from Gino with hands that couldn't stop shaking. I settled out of court because I was a coward, Ziggy whispered into the steam of the mug. He didn't look up. I thought money was the only way to fix the world because it was the only thing I had. I was young, drunk on my own power, and I thought I was invincible. Until that night. Until I saw your car go over the edge. Ziggy looked up then, and his face was wet with more than just shower water. I've lived in that river every day since, Gino. When I found out it was you. I thought if I could just make you smile once, I could finally breathe. But I only made it worse. I turned your healing into a lie. Gino looked at the man he should hate, the man who had caused his greatest tragedy, and saw the same haunting he saw in his own mirror every morning. You did, Gino said, his voice quiet but firm. You lied to me every single day. I know, Ziggy sobbed, his head dropping. I'm so sorry. I love you so much it's killing me, and I know I have no right to even say the words. Gino sat next to him, the space between them filled with the hum of the heater and the scent of honey. He didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. But he didn't ask him to leave, either. Drink your milk, Ziggy, Gino said softly. And then you're going to sleep. We'll talk when you aren't blue. Chapter 8, Rebuilding the Foundation. Ziggy slept for 14 hours. It wasn't the peaceful sleep of the forgiven, but the heavy, drug-like stupor of total physical and emotional exhaustion. Gino checked on him every hour, standing in the doorway of the guest room. Seeing the ruthless Ziggy Carlton curled beneath a faded wool blanket, his hair messy and his face finally losing that ghostly pallor, made Gino's chest ache with a confusing mixture of resentment and tenderness. When Ziggy finally emerged the next afternoon, he was wearing a pair of Gino's oversized sweatpants and a t-shirt that hung off his smaller frame. He looked vulnerable, stripped of the silk and Italian leather that defined his public existence. I made soup, Gino said, not looking up from his laptop at the kitchen table. Sit. Ziggy obeyed in silence. He ate slowly, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the bowl. The air between them was thick, but the jagged, screaming edge of the previous night had softened into something somber. I'm not going back, Ziggy, Gino said, finally closing his laptop. Ziggy flinched, his spoon clicking against the porcelain. I understand. I'll have Marcus send over the final severance. No, Gino interrupted. I mean, I'm not going back to the city. To the office. I've started freelance consulting. I can do the work from here, looking at the trees instead of the glass. Ziggy looked up, a flicker of hope, and then a deeper shadows of doubt, crossing his face. If that's what makes you feel safe, then that's what you should do. I'll leave after I finish this. I won't bother you again. Gino watched him for a long moment. He thought about the months of rides, the way Ziggy had anticipated his every need, and the way he had sat on that porch in a freezing deluge just to apologize. The lie was unforgivable, but the remorse was undeniable. I didn't say you had to leave today, Gino said quietly. Ziggy's breath hitched. Gino. You said you've lived in that river every day since the accident, Gino said, his voice steady. I have too. Maybe we can't get out of the water alone. But I can't have Mr. Carlton here. I can't have the man who thinks he can buy his way out of a nightmare. He's dead, Ziggy said, his voice raw. I don't want to be that man anymore. I haven't wanted to be him since the moment I saw you in that break room. Then stay for a few days, Gino said. No CEO talk. No talk of debts or settlements. Just Ziggy and Gino. The days that followed were quiet and rhythmic. They didn't jump into romance, the wound was too deep for that. Instead, they built a foundation of mundane moments. Ziggy, who had likely never cleaned a dish in his life, insisted on washing up after every meal. He helped Gino weed the overgrown garden, his expensive hands getting stained with dirt and chlorophyll. They talked about Gab. Gino told stories that weren't about the accident, stories about Gab's terrible cooking and his obsession with finding the perfect lens flare. Ziggy listened with a rapt, pained attention, honoring the man he had never met by learning the shape of the hole he had left behind. Ziggy eventually had to return to the city to manage his company, but he didn't disappear. He took the 3-hour drive every Friday evening, arriving with a bag of groceries and a tired smile. He kept his promise, he never pressured Gino to return, and he never touched a drop of alcohol, sticking strictly to tea or sparkling water. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies, Ziggy reached out and tentatively brushed his fingers against Gino's hand. Do you think? Ziggy started, his voice barely a whisper. Do you think you'll ever be able to trust me again? Truly. Gino looked at their joined hands. The height difference was noticeable even sitting down, Gino's hand easily dwarfed Ziggy's. He felt the warmth of the younger man's skin and the steady, honest pulse in his wrist. I trust that you're sorry, Gino said honestly. And I trust that you love me. The rest we build one day at a time. Ziggy squeezed his hand, a single tear tracking through the dirt on his cheek. I can wait a lifetime for that. Epilogue, the weight of forgiveness. 1 year had passed since Gino had opened his door to find a blue-lipped, broken man on his porch. The gray cottage in the suburbs was no longer a place of exile, it had become a home. The salt air had done what the city's sterile air could not, it had cleared the lungs of the ghosts that haunted them. Gino sat in his sunroom, his laptop glowing with the final pages of a strategy report for a client. He worked remotely now, his brilliance sought after by firms that didn't mind his refusal to step foot in a corporate high-rise. He was happy. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were no longer a nightly visitor. The sound of tires on gravel announced Ziggy's arrival. It was Friday, 6 p.m. Ziggy was never late. Gino met him at the door. Ziggy looked different than the man from a year ago. He was still the CEO, still sharp and capable, but the coldness had been replaced by a quiet, grounded warmth. He stepped into the house and immediately pulled Gino into a hug, burying his face in the crook of Gino's neck. "Long week?" Gino asked, his large hands rubbing circles into Ziggy's back. "The board is a headache," Ziggy murmured, his voice muffled by Gino's skin. "But the drive was worth it. You smell like the sea." That night, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The air was charged, the careful boundaries they had built over a year of rebuilding finally beginning to dissolve. After a quiet dinner, they moved to the bedroom. The rain was drumming softly against the roof, a gentle sound now, no longer a threat. When they finally came together, the power dynamic that had once defined them, the CEO and the strategist, the debtor and the survivor, vanished completely. Ziggy, usually the one in control of every room he entered, was utterly overwhelmed. Gino, with his quiet strength and his steady hands, took charge of the space between them. Standing an inch taller and broader of shoulder, Gino moved with a deliberate, haunting slowness. He was a master of sensory overload, every touch was calculated to make Ziggy's skin hum, every whispered word of forgiveness and desire making Ziggy's breath catch in his throat. Ziggy found himself breathless, his hands clutching at Gino's shoulders as he was pulled into a tide of sensation. It was too much and not enough all at once. The younger man, stripped of his suits and his ego, felt every inch of the love Gino was pouring into him. "Gino, please," Ziggy gasped, his head falling back against the pillows, his eyes clouded with a mix of pleasure and raw emotion. He felt small in Gino's arms, but for the first time in his life, being small felt safe. "I've got you," Gino whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle the last of Ziggy's tremors. "I'm not letting go." They shared a passionate, exhaustive night that felt like the final seal on their recovery. When the sun began to peek through the curtains the next morning, they were tangled together, limbs heavy and hearts quiet. Ziggy lay with his head on Gino's chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic thud of the heart he had nearly stopped. He reached up, tracing the scar on Gino's ribs with a reverent finger. He didn't apologize this time. The time for apologies had passed. Gino kissed the top of Ziggy's head, pulling the blanket up over them both. The river was still out there, flowing toward the sea, but they weren't in it anymore. They were on the shore, and they were finally, truly, on dry land.